So today I'm going to answer a really interesting question. And this question comes from Rohit, and he sent me a direct message through Facebook for this one. And so I'm just going to read this question and then we'll break it down. It says, trauma survivors perceive hope as a threat. Does that make SFBT less suitable, considering that SFBT therapists are essentially hope merchants? So that's one question, is SFBT less suitable? And the second part of that is, what are the unique challenges working with this population, and how do we customize to make it more suitable? So I'm going to kind of attend to each part of that in sequence. So the first part that he wrote was, trauma survivors perceive hope as a threat. And I'm going to push back a bit on Rohit here, right? I think first of all, it's challenging to put an entire group of people into one category and say anyone who has experienced a trauma feels threatened by hope. And so I think we got to be careful in taking a stance like that. What I would say is I think sometimes people who have experienced a trauma might worry that if they allow themselves to become hopeful, that they'll recover, or that they'll feel better, or that things will improve, or that their symptoms will go away, that perhaps they might be disappointed. But I don't think necessarily that means that it's a threat to them. I think that each one of us would be in some sense wise to plan or to have something on the back burner of, what if this doesn't work out the way that I was hoping it was going to work out? Or what happens if I get let down by this? So in some sense, I would say it's not actually threatening, but it's actually quite smart. And it's actually potentially quite adaptable, because then they're prepared for what might come. And I think sometimes when people experience trauma, one of the things that happens is that they get taken off guard, right? That the trauma, the memories or the flashbacks or those kinds of things, they become troublesome or worrisome or difficult because I wasn't expecting it, right? And so one of the things that I would say is, if we shift our perspective a bit to say, perhaps that's quite adaptive and perhaps that's quite useful, then maybe we don't look at it so much as a threat, but we look at it as something that's adaptable. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second part is the next part of the question. He says, does that make SFBT less suitable because we're dealing with hope? And so because I kind of pushed back on the first part, then the obvious answer for this next part is no. Solution-focused brief therapy can be quite effective, actually, with people who experience trauma. And one of the evidences of that is that Elliot and Johnny Kim and Jackie von Zifferberg and I wrote a book entitled Solution-Focused Brief Therapy with Clients Managing Trauma, right? So there's a lot of work that has gone in to show actually, and the very first word of that book is hope, right? And so one of the things that I would say is we believe wholeheartedly that hope is actually the antidote to a trauma response. That when I find hope, when I let hope flourish, then my hope can overcome potential trauma symptoms. So one of the things that I would say that's in connection to that is that Jackie writes a lot about being resilientologists, right? That we can either be victimologists, where we're looking for why clients have been victimized, or we can look at their resilience story. So given this horrific thing that has happened to them, how are they thriving or surviving? What keeps them moving day after day? What helps them put one foot in front of the other? And I think each one of those things, each small step, each small focus, each small movement forward actually is a reason to cherish and rejoice in growing hope, right? And so one of the things I think that's also really important about this piece here is that we can draw on broaden and build theory by Barbara Fredrickson. And one of the things that she talks about is that when clients feel negative emotion, which I would say is probably one of the predominant factors of trauma, is that people feel negative emotion. What happens is their vision and their creativity and their options to see get narrower and narrower and narrower. And so they feel like they're going to be stuck in this rut forever. But one of the things that is the antidote to that is what she calls positive emotion, hope being one of those positive emotions. And when people feel hope, what actually happens is their physical vision gets bigger, they can see more, but in addition to that, their creative vision and their opportunity to think outside the box or to see possible options expands over time. And so if we deal in hope, or like Rohit said, if we're hope merchants, one of the things that ends up happening is that people begin to feel hopeful and possibilities open to them. New ways of behaving open to them, new ways of coping open up to them. And so I would say in some sense, if we aren't dealing hope, we probably aren't doing people who have experienced trauma very much good at all. And so then the last part, right? He says, what are the unique challenges with working with this population, and how do we customize it, what we do, in order to make it work for them? And one of the things that I would say is, the first thing I would say is we have to get rid of thinking about this as an approach that needs to fit a particular problem. And instead, we need to be thinking about this as an approach that fits a particular person, right? Each one of us is dealing with something, and we're trying to manage something, and we're trying to improve our lives in some way. And to put an entire group of people together to say, well, those people over there have experienced trauma, so we have to treat them differently, or we have to do something different with them. I think that's a pretty narrow way to describe the variety of people and the differences within people and the uniqueness of people. And so one of the things that I would say is the way that we modify what we do isn't by presenting problem or isn't by previous life experience, but instead it's by what does this person say in this particular moment. When I begin the session and I say, what are your best hopes? I don't mean, what are your best hopes as a trauma survivor? I mean, you as an entire person, with trauma being one aspect of that, what are your best hopes? So maybe it's, what are your best hopes as a woman? What are your best hopes as an Asian? What are your best hopes as a trauma survivor? What are your best hopes as somebody who is 12 years old, right? Each one of those factors may make a huge intersecting impact. And so I would say we modify it not because of what they've been through, but because of who they are in totality. And I say we ask our questions really, really purposefully and really, really meaningfully to say, can you teach me how to engage with you in just the right way? And so I think, in essence, we stop looking at trauma as one of the things that we need to be cautious of or tiptoe around, and instead we say, can you tell me how that fits in with who you are as a person? And given that that's what's going on for you, what are you hopeful for? And so I think really what we need to be doing is we need to be taking in the totality of somebody, not necessarily one or two experiences that they might have had.